The marble beneath his knees had grown warm from his trembling. In the Villa Hadriana, where purple silk hung like blood against white columns, a 17-year-old boy from the Nile Delta pressed his forehead to the floor as sandaled feet approached. The emperor's breathing was shallow, deliberate. Behind carved screens, senators' wives whispered in Greek about the beauty that had sailed from Alexandria, the boy whose honey-colored skin would soon bear the weight of Rome's most dangerous desires. Antinous had entered the palace as a gift. He would leave it as a god. But the months between those two fates would carve themselves into his flesh like hieroglyphs of suffering, each day a small death in service to the man who ruled the world. The year was 123 CE. Rome's borders stretched from the fog-shrouded walls of Britannia to the sun-baked temples of Syria. In this empire of marble and blood, beauty was currency, and youth its most precious denomination. Hadrian ruled not from the seven hills alone, but from a network of villas that stretched across his dominion like a spider's web of power. The Villa Hadriana at Tibur was his masterpiece, a sprawling complex where Greek philosophy met Egyptian mysticism, where stolen statues from conquered lands watched over gardens perfumed with roses and bitter almond. Here, in chambers lined with porphyry and gold, the emperor collected his treasures. Not just artworks plundered from Athens or Alexandria, but living beauties plucked from the provinces, boys with eyes like dark honey, girls with skin pale as Carrara marble, all of them bound by chains more delicate than iron. Gratitude, fear, and the terrible mathematics of survival. Antinous arrived in the 20th year of Hadrian's reign, part of a diplomatic gift from the Roman governor of Egypt. The boy's beauty was legend even then, features carved by gods who understood proportion, a smile that could stop conversation in the forum. But beauty in the imperial household was never innocent. It was a blade that cut both ways. The villa's corridors whispered with the footsteps of those who had come before, Persian princes reduced to ornaments, Germanic warriors' sons who learned to pour wine with hands that had once held spears. The imperial bedchamber had consumed them all, digesting their dignity as surely as their flesh. Yet, Hadrian was no crude tyrant drunk on power. This was a man who could recite Homer from memory, who designed aqueducts and rebuilt the Pantheon. His desires were refined, philosophical, which made them infinitely more dangerous. He spoke to his beautiful captives of Plato's Symposium, of the noble love between mentor and student. He wrapped his appetites in marble rhetoric about Greek ideals, as if words could sanctify what happened when the oil lamps dimmed. Antinous learned quickly that survival meant more than submission. In the villa's library, where scrolls of poetry crumbled to dust beside treatises on engineering, the boy discovered that intelligence could be armor. He studied the emperor's moods like a priest reading omens, learned to speak Latin without the thick accent that marked him as provincial prey. But knowledge was its own trap. The more Hadrian valued his mind, the deeper the boy sank into a web of intimacy that was part philosophy lesson, part violation. The emperor would spend hours explaining the finer points of Stoicism, while his hands mapped territories on flesh that belonged by law and custom entirely to Rome. The other members of the imperial household watched with the careful neutrality of those who had learned to survive by becoming invisible. The Syrian eunuchs who managed the domestic affairs. The Germanic guards who had traded their tribal freedom for Roman gold. The Greek tutors who taught rhetoric while their students learned harder lessons about power in adjacent chambers. None spoke of what they witnessed. In Hadrian's villa, silence was the highest virtue. Discretion the most valued skill. Those who forgot this lesson simply disappeared, reassigned to distant provinces, or found floating in the Tiber with their throats opened like second mouths. For 3 years, this was Antinous' world, a cage built from marble and poetry, where every sunset brought the soft knock on his chamber door and the emperor's cultivated voice asking if he had finished his studies, where every dawn meant waking with bruises hidden beneath silk robes, and the slow walk to the baths where warm water would wash away the evidence but never the memory. The boy learned to smile while his soul retreated to places Hadrian's hands could not reach. He learned to recite Sappho's verses about beauty, while his own beauty was catalogued and consumed like wine from a precious amphora. He learned to be grateful for the privilege of his suffering because in Rome, gratitude was survival. But the human spirit, like water, always seeks its own level. And in the autumn of 130 CE, as the imperial entourage prepared for a journey up the sacred Nile, something in Antinous began to crack like marble under pressure. The boy who had learned to survive by becoming what others desired was about to discover what he truly was. The Nile in October ran dark as spilled wine. Hadrian's flotilla moved upstream like a floating palace. Barges heavy with purple awnings and the weight of imperial ambition. The emperor had come to Egypt to found a city, to leave his mark on the land where pharaohs had once carved their names in stone. But the river gods were hungry, and they would demand a price written in flesh. By now, Antinous was no longer the trembling boy who had knelt on marble floors. At 21, his beauty had ripened into something more dangerous, the kind that inspired poets to madness and emperors to acts of folly. His Greek had become flawless, his understanding of philosophy sharp enough to cut. But beneath the polished surface, something had begun to fester like a wound that would not heal. The breaking point had come months earlier in the villa's moonlit gardens. A Syrian merchant's son, barely 16, had been presented as a gift from the governor of Damascus. The boy's terror was as fresh as morning dew, his innocence unmarked by the careful scars of survival. Antinous watched from behind a column as Hadrian's fingers traced the newcomer's jawline, heard the emperor whisper the same philosophical justifications about Greek love and noble mentorship. That night, as slaves carried the Syrian boy's unconscious form from the imperial chambers, Antinous felt something die inside his chest. The boy's blood on the marble tiles was still warm when morning came. The Syrian would recover, would learn to smile and bow and swallow his dignity in measured doses. But in that moment of violation, Antinous saw his own reflection in another's agony. The knowledge ate at him like poison. In the villa's library, surrounded by scrolls that praised the virtue of Roman civilization, he began to understand the mathematics of his situation. He was not Hadrian's beloved companion. He was the emperor's favorite method of consuming beauty, refined over years of practice until the process had achieved an awful perfection. Worse still was the terrible recognition that he had become complicit. His very survival, his adaptation, had enabled the emperor's appetites. Each smile he had perfected, each learned response to Hadrian's touch, had been a lesson for the next boy who would take his place. The Syrian was not the first replacement Antinous had witnessed, nor would he be the last. On the Nile, these revelations pressed against him like the weight of deep water. The Egyptian priests who greeted Hadrian spoke of ancient rituals, of sacrifices that could grant immortality. They whispered of the Nile's power to transform, to wash away sin and rebirth the soul in sacred waters. Antinous listened with the desperate attention of a drowning man reaching for rope. The emperor, meanwhile, was planning his city. Antinopolis, he would call it, a name that would echo through history, carved in stone and painted on papyrus. But the city was meant to celebrate not just Antinous' beauty, but Hadrian's possession of it. Every temple, every street, every column would be a monument to the emperor's refined appetites, legitimized by architecture and time. The irony was not lost on the young man whose name would grace the marble inscriptions. He had become so perfectly what Hadrian desired that the emperor could no longer imagine a world without him. But Antinous had begun to imagine exactly that, a world where his beauty could not be harvested, where his flesh could rest unmarked by imperial hands. The river moved them deeper into Egypt, toward temples older than Rome itself. Here, where crocodile gods basked on muddy banks and ibis birds stalked through reed marshes, the weight of empire seemed lighter. The local priests spoke of death as transformation, of the soul's journey through underworld trials toward rebirth. Their words fell on Antinous' ears like benediction. On the night before they reached the sacred city of Hermopolis, the young man made his choice. In his cabin, as the Nile lapped against the barge's hull like whispered prayers, he penned no farewell letters. The living rarely understand the logic of the dying, and Hadrian least of all would comprehend why perfect beauty might choose oblivion over preservation. Instead, Antinous spent his final hours studying his own reflection in the dark water that flowed past his window. The face that looked back was still beautiful, but it was no longer innocent. The eyes held knowledge no 21-year-old should carry. The understanding that some forms of love were indistinguishable from consumption, that survival could be its own form of death. When morning came and the emperor's servants found his chambers empty, the Nile had already claimed its sacrifice. The river that had witnessed the rise and fall of pharaohs that had carried the prayers of the desperate and the ambitious for 3,000 years, now bore the body of a boy who had chosen drowning over another sunrise in golden chains. The Egyptian priests nodded with ancient wisdom. The river gods had taken their due. But what they had given in return would prove more terrible than what they had claimed. The Emperor of Rome wept like a woman at her child's pyre. For 3 days, Hadrian would not emerge from his cabin. The imperial barge drifted rudderless on the sacred river, while the most powerful man in the world pressed his face against silk pillows that still carried the scent of sandalwood and youth. His sobs echoed across the water, raw and animal, the sound of something fundamental breaking inside a man who had never learned to lose what he loved. The court physicians whispered of madness brought on by Egyptian heat. The senators muttered about the dangerous precedent of imperial grief. But the priests of Thoth, ancient keepers of wisdom, understood what they witnessed. This was not the mourning of a ruler for a subject. This was the agony of addiction severed from its source. When Hadrian finally emerged, his eyes were carved hollow by sleeplessness. His first command would have seemed absurd if spoken by any other man. Antinous was to be declared a god. Not the patron deity of a single city, but a god whose worship would span the empire. Temples would rise in his honor from Britannia to Syria. His image would be carved in marble, cast in bronze, painted on villa walls where wealthy Romans sought his blessing. The boy who had died to escape immortalization would achieve the most complete immortalization in Roman history. The transformation began immediately. Egyptian embalmers, masters of their art, worked by torchlight to preserve what the river had returned. They wrapped the drowned boy in linen, soaked with frankincense and myrrh, the same spices used to honor pharaohs, but beneath their practiced hands lay flesh that bore stories no sacred wrapping could conceal. The scars were mapped like a geography of suffering. Here, the faint marks where silk cords had bound wrists too tightly. There, the permanent bruising along collarbones from fingers that gripped too hard. The embalmers worked in silence, understanding that some truths were too dangerous for words, even whispered to the dead. While priests chanted hymns to speed the new god's journey through the underworld, Hadrian began the more practical work of rewriting history. Scribes labored through the night, crafting official accounts of Antinous' life that emphasized his virtue, his learning, his noble sacrifice to the Nile gods. The darker truths were scraped from papyrus as thoroughly as old paint from marble walls. The city of Antinopolis rose from Egyptian sand with supernatural speed. 10,000 workers labored under the desert sun, their sweat mixing with mortar as they built monuments to love disguised as conquest. Every street was laid according to Hadrian's precise instructions, every temple positioned to catch the light at the exact angle that had illuminated Antinous' face during their morning discussions of philosophy. But the emperor's masterpiece was the central shrine, where a colossal statue of the new god gazed eternally eastward toward the rising sun. The sculpture was perfect in every detail. The curve of lips that had learned to smile on command, the eyes that had held such terrible knowledge, the hands that had trembled against marble floors in palaces far from home. Yet, in transforming flesh to stone, something essential had been lost. The statue possessed Antinous' beauty, but none of his humanity. The cult spread across the empire with the efficiency of imperial infrastructure. In Rome, wealthy citizens commissioned household shrines where they could pray to the beautiful god for protection of their own lovely children. In Gaul, Celtic druids adapted ancient rituals to honor the young deity who had drowned for wisdom. In Greece, philosophers debated whether Antinous represented the perfection of Platonic love or its ultimate corruption. None of them understood what they were truly worshipping. The official hymns praised the god's willing sacrifice, his noble choice to join the immortals through sacred drowning. They spoke of divine love, of souls ascending to celestial realms. But the priests who tended his shrines most faithfully were those who recognized the truth written in the statue's marble eyes, that some escapes are worth any price, even oblivion. Hadrian visited the new city obsessively, standing for hours before the great statue as if conversation was still possible. Palace servants reported finding him at dawn, still talking to the carved features about architectural plans, about new poems he had written, about the Syrian boy who had been quietly sent away to prevent Uncomfortable comparisons. The emperor aged a decade in the year following Antinous' death. His hair went white as marble, his hands developed a tremor that made writing difficult. The man who had rebuilt the Pantheon and strengthened Britannia's wall began to speak increasingly of his own mortality, of the day when he too would join the gods. But Antinous had achieved something his deification could never grant. In choosing death over continued survival, he had escaped the cycle that consumed so many others. The Syrian boy and those who came after would face their own choices, but they would do so knowing that even the most beautiful prison had walls that could be broken. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. Hadrian had meant to preserve his beloved forever, to make him immortal through stone and bronze and imperial decree. Instead, he had created the most enduring monument to the very system that had destroyed what he claimed to love. Every temple to Antinous was also a temple to the appetites that had driven a 21-year-old to seek refuge in dark water. The Nile flowed on, carrying new secrets toward the Mediterranean. In the depths where Antinous had found his freedom, crocodiles basked in shafts of underwater sunlight, and the river gods counted their newest treasure among the accumulating silence of the drowned. 2,000 years have passed since the Nile claimed its sacrifice. Yet Antinous' marble eyes still stare from museum halls across the world. More statues survive of him than of any figure save the emperors themselves. Hundreds of carved faces frozen in eternal youth, each one a question mark chiseled in stone. The official story endured as long as the empire that created it. Antinous, the willing sacrifice, the noble lover who chose divine transformation over mortal limitations. Christian emperors eventually banned his worship, declaring the cult pagan blasphemy, but they could not destroy what Hadrian's grief had carved into marble. The statues survived in buried villas, in forgotten temples, in the private collections of those who understood that some beauty transcends the politics of its creation. Renaissance scholars, rediscovering the classical world, saw only what the inscriptions told them to see. Here was Platonic love made manifest, the pure attachment between mentor and student that Greek philosophy had elevated to sacred art. They carved new versions of his face, painted his drowning as heroic sacrifice, wrote poems celebrating the love that had moved an emperor to tears. But marble holds secrets that poetry cannot express. Modern archaeologists, working with tools their predecessors lacked, have begun to read the evidence written in stone and bronze. The medical examinations of surviving statues reveal details the ancient sculptors captured with uncomfortable accuracy. The subtle asymmetries that speak of old injuries, the tension held in carved shoulders that had learned to brace for impact. More telling still are the discoveries made in recent decades at excavation sites across the former empire. In villa cellars from Britain to Syria, archaeologists have uncovered rooms whose purposes the historical record never acknowledged. Chambers with iron rings set into walls, with drainage systems designed for washing away evidence, with acoustics that would muffle the sounds of suffering from the rooms above. These discoveries force an uncomfortable reckoning with the mythology that has surrounded Antinous for 2 millennia. The beautiful god of noble sacrifice begins to look more like a victim of systematic abuse. His deification, a masterpiece of imperial propaganda designed to obscure the very crimes it claimed to honor. Yet even this reading leaves questions that may never find answers. The ancient sources speak with one voice about Antinous' intelligence, his quick mastery of language and philosophy. Was his final choice truly the desperate act of a broken victim, or the calculated decision of someone who understood exactly what his death would accomplish? Some scholars suggest a third possibility, and that Antinous orchestrated his own transformation from victim to symbol, using his death as a weapon against the system that had consumed him. In this interpretation, his drowning becomes not an escape, but an act of rebellion, the ultimate refusal to remain silent about the realities of imperial love. The evidence for this theory lies not in what the ancient sources say, but in what they do not. No contemporary writer describes Antinous as naive or passive. Even Hadrian's own poets, crafting official verses about divine love, let slip details that suggest their subject possessed a will as strong as his beauty. The boy who learned to survive the imperial household for 7 years was no helpless victim, but a young man who understood power and how to navigate its currents. If this reading is correct, Then Antinous achieved something unprecedented in the ancient world. He forced his abuser to immortalize not just his beauty, but the very system that had destroyed him. Every temple built in his honor was also a monument to the appetites that had driven him to the Nile. Every prayer offered at his shrines was also an acknowledgement that the most beautiful things in Rome were often the most exploited. The cult of Antinous spread precisely because it spoke to truths the empire preferred not to acknowledge. In a world where power consumed beauty as routinely as wine consumed water, the young god offered something unprecedented, the promise that even the most trapped could find freedom, even if only through the ultimate refusal to continue. Modern visitors to the museums where his statues rest often report the same uncanny sensation, the feeling that those marble eyes are looking back, that some essential awareness has survived the centuries. Perhaps this is only the human tendency to find consciousness in familiar forms, to project life onto stone that resembles life. Or perhaps Antinous achieved exactly what he intended, not the false immortality of Hadrian's temples, but the true immortality of those who force the powerful to confront their own monstrosity. In choosing death over continued survival, he ensured that his story would outlive the empire that created it, that questions about power and beauty and the price of both would echo in every gallery where his face is displayed. The Nile flows on, carrying its secrets toward the sea, in its depths where sunlight turns to darkness and the weight of water silences even the gods. Perhaps a 21-year-old boy finally found the peace that 7 years in marble palaces had never offered. But on the surface, in the world of light and air and human memory, his questions remain as urgent today as they were when Roman galleys first carried his story upstream against the current of time. The most beautiful slave in history had become its most enduring witness. The boy who died to escape immortalization had achieved the only immortality that matters. Not the bronze and marble kind that emperors command, but the kind that lives in the human recognition that some prices are too high to pay, some forms of love too dangerous to survive, and some freedoms worth any sacrifice to claim.